All right, so this is continuing with the theme of the Second World War, but this lecture is focusing much more on the American home front. So, domestic things going on in the United States, some of the social changes that are happening there, social, economic, and what have you, during the war. And this is also the lecture where I end the war too. We talk about how and why it comes to an end. And in this one, we're going to talk about the home front in the sense that this is also a place where things are changing. The home front just refers to the people left behind, domestic areas, the part of the country that's not at war. So basically, just the continental United States here. And a lot of times, a home front will simply refer to um, an area like this, just the domestic side, the domestic area, because a lot of times war is very all-encompassing and it will affect the civilian areas, even if there's no fighting happening there. So that's what we're going to look at today. And the United States, by 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. They get involved in the war. By 1942, they're a bit more into it. And the United States, just as a recap, they end up joining the side of the Allies, which is, of course, the United States and their allies, Britain, France, the USSR, the Soviet Union, Russia, and China, who was under attack by Japan. And of course, the Axis powers were the enemies in World War II for the United States, the enemies being Germany, Nazi Germany, for Italy for a little while, then they go away. They surrender, change sides. Very complicated. The reason you don't really hear too much about Italy in the Second World War. Um, and also, of course, Japan was part of the Axis powers. The United States had a big enemy in Japan after the Pearl Harbor attack. So during the war, what's going on? One of the biggest changes for the United States at home is industrial mobilization. There is a huge demand for war material, things like tanks, planes, bullets, uniforms, food, everything in the world really you need to fight a world war. And the United States is going to have to step it up and step up its industrial game and make stuff to meet the demands of warfare. They're going to have to start producing stuff for the war. And this is indeed it. If you were wondering what's going on, I thought we were just talking about the Great Depression. What happened to that? Yes, it is the Second World War that definitively ends the Great Depression because it's all of this industrial mobilization, all of this war production, making all this stuff to meet the war needs. That's what finally creates enough jobs that ends that high level of unemployment that really signified a Great Depression. Like that was why it was such an economic issue, the Great Depression because there was no jobs. So with the Second World War, you have plenty of jobs. And with all of these jobs, the unemployment rate drops. And you can see here, uh, 1929, 30, the unemployment rate's skyrocketing with the Great Depression. Some of FDR's New Deal stuff, he tries to create jobs and change the government a bit to lower it. That helps lower the unemployment rate, but it still doesn't really get it ever below that 15% mark. It's only, oops, here's when the war starts to really take off. That's when the unemployment rate really goes way, way down. You've got lots more people in jobs. And to help coordinate all of this production, the production of all this stuff that the United States is making, the government creates with FDR something known as the War Production Board, which was formed in January 1942. And what it does is it allowed the federal government to aid in the conversion of factories to war production. So it helps the government fund and facilitate the transition of factories, things like if you had a factory that made cars, it would be converted into a tank factory. If you had a clothing factory, it would be converted into a uniform factory. Anything to help expedite this process and make it a lot quicker and help sort of smooth the things along so that people could indeed make stuff faster to meet this really huge burgeoning demand for war material. And you can see here by this chart how much stuff they're making. They're making a lot of stuff. Aircraft, ships, ammunitions, combat vehicles, all sorts of stuff. This is just some huge numbers, billions of dollars that they're putting into it in the 1940s. It's expanding a huge amount. In 1942, it expands. 1943, 44, the United States is producing billions and billions of dollars worth of munitions and war products. And what the War Production Board also did, how it also changes society, how it changes the United States and its economy, is that the War Production Board prohibits the production of a lot of non-essential goods. Which means if you have a car factory, you're just not allowed to say no. You have to produce tanks or aircraft because it is for the greater good. A lot of things like luxury goods are banned from being produced because they're seen as a waste. Things like nylon stockings. You're not allowed to create something frivolous like nylon stockings. They're like kind of like pantyhose today. That's illegal because you need that nylon for a lot of war materials. It's important in gas masks. It's important in parachutes as well. Silk, you're not allowed to use silk for dresses because they're using silk for parachutes. So it helps kind of curtail waste and non-essential production. The War Production Board also sets ration limits. You can only have a certain amount of gas or oil or rubber to use for civilian use because the war just takes precedence. It's the most important thing. And of course, now, okay, we've got lots and lots of jobs now, lots of things you need to do. People need to get working in those factories to make all this stuff. But yeah, it's a war. So guess who's all fighting it? A lot of men. So you still need people to do stuff. So the job falls a lot of times on American women, and this is a very classic thing of World War II is this is the first time in quite a long time that a large portion of the female population in the United States is employed in war work. I mean, women have always worked, whether it's in the house or in a factory. You remember all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, the Lowell Mill girls. But this is something different. This is a much wider scale, and it's encouraged very heavily. The During the Great Depression, it was discouraged. The American government did not want women working because it was seen as taking away a job from a man who would have a family to provide for. But now the tune has changed. And at the height of the war, over 19 million women end up serving in the labor force. Even traditionally, women who would not have worked or even thought of working if it wasn't for the need of war goods. You know, you've got middle class mothers, older women, women who had retired, like retired teachers, are taking war jobs to help this war effort because it was seen as, the more you work, the more stuff you make, the quicker the war will be over. You can save a life. It's very patriotic. And there was a sense too, though, that these new jobs for women weren't it wasn't billed as, wow, women's liberation, look at this, we can do a man's job. It was very much couched in the language of it's just for the duration. This is only an aberration in normal social niceties and social mores. This is just a something that's going on because of the circumstances. And even the machinery and the jobs were kind of simplified and retooled and made easier for women to use. So it's not as if women suddenly had to work a drill press the same way a man would. The drill presses, certain different factory tools and machinery were simplified, the tasks were broken down, the machinery was made easier to operate to accommodate sometimes unskilled women workers, but also just to kind of use their labor to make sure that that they could be, put to use and that their desire to be patriotic and help the war effort could be it could be utilized, but also that you weren't doing too much. This wasn't seen as like a brilliant opportunity for women to suddenly change their social status. And it was very heavily implied that you would happily, gleefully, and willingly walk away from your factory job once the war was over because that job belonged to a man and he was going to need it when he came back. There was a lot of issues after the First World War with there not being enough jobs for soldiers, for returning veterans. And the United States government really didn't want to see that repeated, so they didn't want to suddenly invite all these women into the workforce and keep them there. They wanted them to do it for the duration, for the war, while they were needed, and then kind of get out. There's a video I'll have you watch that kind of illustrates this very well. A lot of propaganda during the time, so that's going to be part of the primary sources to talk a little bit more about the how changes for women and the impact on women and how it was perceived. But there are a lot of changes to daily life. things that affected women as well, because they're the ones on the whole that were kind of staying home while men went off to Europe or the Pacific to fight. But this affected anybody who was at home. If you weren't physically fit to go fight or you're too young or too old, plenty of men stayed behind on the home front there. So changes to daily life for Americans, anybody on the home front really, were numerous. One of it was, I already kind of mentioned this, rationing. The government set ration limits on goods that were in high demand or needed by the war to make sure that people were using them sparingly and that they weren't going to be wasted and they were going to be prioritized for the war effort. Everything was going to go to fighting the war, to the soldiers. So you had things like food was rationed, certain, especially things like sugar. You'd get a ration book like this, and it had these little coupons in it, and the government would give you the ration book. If you lost it, you're out of luck. But if the government would give you this ration book, and the only way a merchant could sell you anything is if you had a little ration coupon. So you had to make these little coupons last for as long as the book was good for. It's usually about a month or so. And that was designed to make it so that people couldn't hoard food, that they couldn't buy more than they really needed, or take advantage of it. They didn't want rich people kind of hoarding food. They didn't want stores price gouging. So this was a way to make sure that people got what they needed, but they didn't overdo it, and make sure that everything, the most important stuff, was saved for the troops. And to kind of make that a little easier, to kind of make your rations stretch a bit more, a lot of Americans planted victory gardens, which was basically just a fancy name given to growing a garden in your backyard. And the idea was that you were growing your own food, and that was very patriotic because that meant that you were saving more for to go to the troops. The industrially produced farm goods and stuff were going straight to the troops. Your victory garden would help supplement your ration book and help sort of save resources for the soldiers. Um, it's kind of a feel-good method. There's a lot of posters and propaganda going around about victory gardens. I'll talk a little bit about that more here. Um, the victory gardens was seen as a way that women can participate in helping out with the war effort. You know, I'll grow my own food, I'll can it, and that'll kind of help save production for the troops. It also was seen as a way, you know, growing a victory garden, growing your own food. It saved rubber and oil because it was seen as less food having to be moved around. You know, you have people in the city growing little victory gardens in their window boxes or in their little small backyards. That's less food that had to be trucked into the city, and that saves rubber and oil, which was desperately needed by the troops, not having to ship it to consumers. So you had those victory gardens, as they were called, and also a lot of people on the home front, civilians, participated in things like scrap drives, is shown here. A lot of times local groups, like this is a local football team, small town community organizations like churches and charities and women's groups would get together, and they would go around and they'd ask people for their scrap metal, especially was very popular. They'd collect it from dumps, they'd seek it out, they'd go door to door and ask, "Hey, you got any junk lying around?" And they'd collect it, they'd take these happy pictures like this, and then they'd ship it off to the War Department, and it would be melted down to be turned into bullets and tanks and whatever was really needed. So it was seen as very patriotic to collect scrap for a scrap metal drive. You were turning junk into war material. And another thing that so that's some changes you see, some social changes, is people getting very patriotic and trying to help the war effort on their own, even though they're not fighting the war. You know, not everybody can drive a tank straight onto a battlefield, but you can help in these little ways. And there was also big pushes on the home front here. Americans start to see in their daily lives really concerted efforts to sell war bonds, also known as Liberty bonds. And what they were is it was a way that people could help pay for the war. What you did with a war bond was you just gave the government your money, and they would give you a little certificate that said, "Thanks, we'll pay you back with a little interest after the war, but hey, thanks for helping finance it." It's kind of a Americans voluntarily loaning money to the government to help pay for the war, because wars are expensive. Those tanks and planes don't make themselves for free. Uh, the money was very urgently needed, so there were a lot of these campaigns to do this, and Americans were very much inundated with propaganda posters like these that were encouraging them to buy those war bonds and invest in the fighting of the war. A lot of times, the images were usually of soldiers, sometimes wounded, sometimes dead, sometimes just fighting. And they were all about sort of pressuring Americans into buying those war bonds because that's really, in the long run, it's the least you can do. I mean, there are men out there sacrificing their lives, getting wounded and killed for this. The least you could do is help fund that war. They're fighting harder than ever. You should be buying war bonds harder than ever. You're sitting there comfy and cozy in your couch at home. Maybe you go off to your war job, but hey, they're on the front lines. You're on the home front. They need all the help that they can get. You need to buy those war bonds. And it's very patriotic too. Lots of stories about people. These groups would get together and canvass around town, go door to door. Oh, we're doing a war bond drive. Would you like to buy a war bond? And you buy war bonds, and a lot of towns were very happy about how much they could raise in the course of a month or something. So it was a way that Americans could participate in helping fight and win the war. But something that you only really this is something very unique to wartime. This is something that really changed in their daily lives. Another big change for Americans that they see is a real, I want to say almost paranoia about security, national security, at home and abroad too, and just a real fear of espionage, a fear of sabotage, a fear of enemy infiltration into American life. Um, Definitely, especially early on in the beginning years of the war, because if you remember, Pearl Harbor attack really shattered Americans' confidence in their national security. They're sitting there thinking, protected on both sides by massive oceans. This is great. No one will ever hurt us. And then there's Pearl Harbor. So Americans were a little shaken by this. And a way that a lot of them tried to fix this problem or to be prepared for something like this for aerial attack was to stage blackout drills. And what a blackout drill was when the local authorities, there was usually like a war board or like some kind of public safety committee, commission or whatever, would plan this and they would tell people, okay, at a certain time we're going to have a drill where you have to turn all your lights out. Everybody. You have to turn your lights out at home. You have to pull down these special curtains called blackout curtains. If you're driving, there's special caps to put over your headlights to cover it. But basically, the idea is to turn out all lights to black out a town or a city because, as this poster says, don't give them a target. If you have a big lit up city and you have an air raid, a big group of planes coming in to drop bombs and try to kill everybody, it's much easier to aim at your target when it's a big bright light down there because usually they would happen at night or in the evenings. So the idea was if everything's blacked out, enemy planes can't see, they can't get a good fix on where a city or a settlement is, and it'll be a lot less accurate, their bombing. So the blackout drills were staged by people who would plan for these potential air raids. They would have blackout drills and tests to kind of run people through their paces, just like you have fire drills in school. They had blackout drills in the United States all over the place. Here in Delaware County, they tried that too. They were doing that in the early 40s to try to prep people for, hey, if it was ever really real, if there was ever really enemy planes in the sky, people would know what to do. They'd have practiced. They'd know how to turn their lights out. They would know they'd hear a siren go off, usually like a police or a fire siren. They'd turn their lights out. They'd stay home, and they would make everything a lot less of a target. Um, this kind of dies out after 1944 when the United States is starting to feel like it's a winner and they haven't been attacked on the home front, so these do kind of fade and go away and a lot of the committees disband. But there was always a pressing concern in daily life during this time for espionage, fears that the United States was full of saboteurs who were going to destroy war factories and do anything they could to harm the United States' war effort and harm their ability to make war and make war goods. And there was also a real push, a real campaign to try to get people to really just shut up about war information and not blabber on about it. You remember back in World War One, the the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, all of those things designed to kind of criminalize talk that hurt the war effort. You don't see something quite as overt during the Second World War, but there is a big push to really just, loose lips sink ships. Shut up if you know anything about the war, because you don't know who's listening. Your neighbor seems pretty nice, but maybe they're a Nazi spy. So don't go telling your neighbor what you heard from your son about where his division is moving, because that might somehow get to the enemy. And as this poster says, careless talk gets there first. You blabber on about where your son's or husband's being deployed. Someone manages to figure out how to get that to the enemy because they're sympathetic to the Nazis or the Japanese. And all of a sudden, your husband's sneak attack on an enemy base is met with the enemies already there anticipating it, and everybody gets killed. So it's kind of another way to really play on the emotions, just like those war bonds posters, to try to get people to just, all right, if you know anything, be quiet. You don't have to go talking about it too much. So keep those, keep that mouth shut. This sentiment is extremely prevalent. The idea that there are enemy spies all over. This sentiment is very prevalent out in the Pacific, the Western states, the Pacific area, because it's closer to Japan geographically, and it has a lot of Japanese Americans in it. And now that Japan is a big enemy of the United States after the Pearl Harbor attack, all of the Japanese Americans become very suspect, that they are sympathetic to Japan, that they are trying to undermine the American war effort, and that something needs to be done because they are all a security risk. As this cartoon, that is by the famous Dr. Seuss. He was a prolific cartoonist during the Second World War for a lot of propaganda purposes. As this cartoon shows, all of the Japanese Americans are lining up to get TNT to go and bomb war factories and to go and help the mother country and destroy the United States. They're already there on US soil, Western states had a large Asian American population, a lot of times Japanese or Chinese. And you can see waiting for the signal from home, there was a big fear that all of these Japanese Americans were the fifth column, the secret enemy within that was waiting to destroy the United States because they were already present there. And something had to be done about them because they were a security risk, that they were all these potential spies and saboteurs. And there's a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. So on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which is known as the Japanese Internment Order. It issues orders to relocate a lot of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast to internment camps. And about 110 to 127,000 Japanese Americans are moved from wherever it is they live, their own private homes, their personal homes, to internment camps. They're forced to sell their homes, sell their businesses, sell all of their belongings, and move to these small like relocation centers. And they're rough, they're cold, they're not very well appointed, they're not comfortable. They're just places to intern or put Japanese Americans to keep them under surveillance and to make sure that they're not causing any issues. And a lot of the Japanese Americans are actually quite patriotic. They love the United States. They fought for the United States in World War II. But it was just there was such a strong fear that this was seen as a way to kind of almost in a way protect them from the harsh anti-Japanese sentiment of the United States, but more so to just be extra careful. Um, in 1988, so decades after the end of the war, President Ronald Reagan passed an act to pay reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned because there was never really evidence that they were plotting there was some big plan that they were cooking up to try to hurt the United States. It was seen as kind of a misstep by FDR to play into the paranoia and the fear and the racial prejudice going on at the time. But really, the cloud of war can really fog many people's minds, and it was indeed the case here too. There's a lot of fear about this, about the threat posed by Japanese Americans. And when there's a famous Supreme Court case that that comes up during this, because there was plenty of Japanese Americans tried to fight this. In 1944, the case Korematsu versus the United States went to the Supreme Court, and this was through a Japanese American man named Fred Korematsu, who claimed that the Japanese internment violated the Fifth Amendment, which is the amendment that says you can't be punished for a crime without going through due process of the law. And he claimed that he was being interned and punished for something that he'd not gone through criminal trial to prove that he was innocent or guilty, that it was incarceration without a trial, a violation of the Fifth Amendment. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court votes to uphold the Order 9066, and say, uh, sorry, this is a military necessity, and that military urgency outweighs personal individual rights in this case. It was too much of a fear, of a concern for Japanese sabotage, Japanese espionage, that during times of war, sometimes you have to look the other way when it comes to constitutional rights for American citizens. So there is some, you think during times of war, sometimes rights are curtailed because of military necessity, of fear for national security. But plenty of Americans saw this as an opportunity to expand rights. And one group was African Americans. They launched something, a lot of African American rights groups launched something known as the Double V campaign. It's officially traced back to an African American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, in 1942, whose editor encouraged African Americans, particularly African American men, to pursue what was called victory over our enemies at home as well as victory over the enemies abroad, the Double V campaign. So they wanted they wanted to encourage African American participation in the war to, of course, achieve democracy and victory over the Nazis and Imperial Japan, but also to use this as an opportunity to show that that they could be that African Americans could be good citizens, that they were patriotic, they were willing to fight for their country, but also trying to show that all of this rhetoric about democracy and equality and trying to, fight evil at home, fight evil abroad, that there was still plenty of inequality and lack of democracy and lack of governmental participation at home, to sort of try to draw attention to this. Kind of like during the First World War, the Harlem Hellfighters trying to push for African American rights by showing that they were good patriotic citizens. The same thing is present again during World War II, where you see a lot of patriotic activity in the African American community trying to use this as an opportunity to gain more rights and more equality for themselves. There's a big thing in World War II. You see people throwing up the symbol a lot. That's not peace. That means that's a V. That's a V for victory. That was like a huge catch thing. You'd see people doing this all the time. That meant, V for victory, victory during the war, victory in the war. And the Double V campaign is adopted, victory at home, victory abroad, victory for African American rights. They wanted to help fight the war effort and sort of use that momentum at home as well, because it was indeed a something that a lot of Americans recognize, is that, yeah, that made them look bad. They're trying to be the good guys here, where they're fighting Nazis, they're fighting people who attacked their home, their little base in Pearl Harbor. Oh, they're fighting the good fight here. And the fact that a lot of their enemies could say, hey, but what about segregation? You're not even treating part of your population with respect to what's going on. It was kind of a very hard to be the good guys when you had that. And the African American community was very aware of that and tried to play it up and be like, you really need to do something about this to protect your public international image and make sure that all citizens are treated with equality. And a lot of, so even FDR, he recognizes this too and tries to make sure that the United States is being as fair as it can be in as many aspects as possible, especially with war employment, because that was a big thing. Men want work. And if you can't fight, or if you're in an essential position where your skills at home in the factory are considered more valuable than your potential for being a soldier, you want that job. And there was a lot of complaints that these hot war jobs that paid really well were only being were kind of being shunted to white men at the expense of others. So the federal government and FDR recognized the importance of really trying to do something about discrimination for the sake of national image and also for the sake of just pragmatic expediency. You know, hey, that's why discriminate when you need as many hands as possible helping make these tanks. Who cares whose hands they are, as long as they can make a tank. So FDR passes another acronym here, the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, enacted in June 1941, which bans discrimination in defense jobs. It essentially says that you can't turn someone away because of their race or their background if they are qualified to do a defense job. You can't just, play favorites. And posters like this make the rounds showing, look at all of these different last names of these men. They're clearly from all different parts of the world. But what are they doing? They're working together because they realize that, hey, we're all Americans here. We got common enemies. We need to put our differences aside and do something to work together and help out this war effort here. Build that tank. It is enacted in June 1941 before Pearl Harbor, back when they were still starting to make goods for that Lend-Lease Act and meet the war effort demands to kind of give goods to Great Britain and France and help them out. But it's better enforced by 1943 when the United States is much more heavily involved in the war because, now they've got skin in the game and they really care a little bit extra about making sure that they're producing at top efficiency here. All right, so that's kind of a lot of stuff going on socially in the United States. You've got um, changes for women, industrial changes, changes at home life, growing victory gardens, people pushing for more social equality and social justice. Boy, it's a busy time. And during all of this turmoil, during the Second World War, as we're getting towards the end of it, there is a change in leadership. I can't just keep going without recognizing the fact that President Franklin D. Roosevelt dies in office April 12th, 1945, and the rest of the ending of the Second World War will be under the leadership of FDR's Vice President Harry Truman, who becomes president when FDR dies in office. He had been sick for a while. He dies, and it's hard for Americans because this has been the man who had shepherded them through some of the worst of the nation's history, the Great Depression, the Second World War. He's just gone, a beloved figure. Now we have Harry Truman, who is not as beloved, but he gets the job done. Like he's a feisty little guy, and he does kind of win the begrudging respect of Americans. He does keep on keeping on here. And it's with Harry Truman in office that the war wraps up. And don't get me wrong here. It's Harry Truman doesn't go ahead and end the war, but he is in office when it happens. He's kind of keeping the United States going. The war had been winding down for quite some time. By 1945, early 1945, it's basically considered over. But it officially ends on May 8th, 1945. The um, the European theater ends when the Nazis surrender, which is the end of the war in Europe here. And Americans celebrate it. They call it VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And you can see in the picture here, what are they doing with their fingers? They're giving the victory symbol. They're very, very happy. It is a momentous occasion. A lot of Americans are quite thrilled. It is very historic. Everyone's very happy. You can kind of tell that the war is, it's not fully over yet because the war in Japan is still going on, and many soldiers who were in Europe are slotted to be moved to the Pacific. But the writing seems to be on the wall that the war is ending and it's going in the right direction for Americans. They're quite happy. They've been fighting for a while, but they are starting to emerge victorious here. And as it becomes apparent that Germany is about to surrender, the United States realizes that, okay, we've got to kind of do something. What are we going to do with Germany after when they finally do surrender? Because um, they don't really want a repeat of the First World War to happen again. What happened after that war, where Germany was basically eviscerated, pushed to the ground, and kicked repeatedly, and then hence causing another world war. So they want to kind of handle it handle it carefully. So before Germany even surrenders, they get together and start talking about it. But once Germany does officially surrender, the leaders get together again to figure out, okay, now what are we going to do? And that happens in Potsdam. It's a meeting between some of the big leaders of the big three of the Allies, the United States. There they are in the middle, Harry Truman trying his best to keep everybody happy. Winston Churchill of Great Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. They were kind of the big winners of the war. And what they do in the Potsdam Conference is they decide that, okay, we do have to do something about the German government. We can't just leave them alone. Because if we just leave them alone after Hitler commits suicide, the Nazis surrender, the war is over in Europe. But they can't just walk away. They have to do something because they don't want the Nazi government to continue. So the Potsdam Conference declares the Nazi government illegitimate. That if you're, anybody who was a Nazi has to be purged from government. You can't keep dealing with a Nazi-run government in Germany. They also declare that a lot of the Nazi officials have to be tried for war crimes, for some of the things that they did to the civilian populations, things like the Holocaust, some of the actions they took when they were occupying France. So there is going to be a long series of trials trying to determine guilt of people who committed human rights violations under the Nazi government. The other thing that happens during the Potsdam Conference is Joseph Stalin gets his way. He demands that a lot of Eastern Europe be put under his control because, in his mind and in his words, he's been invaded by Germany twice in the past century, and that's not going to happen again. So he wants to have control over a lot of Eastern Europe, and the rest of the Allies are really in no position to tell him no, because it was Soviet Russia that took the brunt of the German forces down there in the Eastern Front and bled that country dry and helped make the war a little easier to win on the Western Front, the France English side. So nobody really is in a position to tell Joseph Stalin no. I imagine it's a very hard thing to tell a dictator like Joseph Stalin no. So he gets a lot of control over Eastern Europe, and it really starts to set up the post-war world where now that Germany is no longer a threat, the next threat is going to be the Soviet Union because they come out on top in that geographical area. And the United States kind of wakes up and is like, oh yeah, we still don't like them. We never have. We just had a common enemy in Nazi Germany with them for a while, so we kind of forced ourselves to smile and shake hands while we fought them. But now that that's out of the way, we still hate them. We still hate the Soviet Union. We still hate their communist government, hate dictators like Joseph Stalin, who, yeah, he's a huge violator of human rights. I won't even get into the millions and millions of people that have died because of his rule. And that's going to be the next big challenge the United States faces is the threat of Soviet Russia. But we still have Japan. Yeah, war's still going on. Very excited about war ending in Europe, but the war in the Pacific is still raging, and it's still extremely deadly for a lot of the US Marines that are there. And the United States had been trying to figure out a way to develop a weapon that would force the Japanese to surrender. The biggest issue with this was they were afraid the Japanese never would because it went against their culture at the time to surrender was seen as worse than death. And a lot of American troops were dying because instead of surrendering, sometimes Japanese troops they would do like things like suicide bombing, and it was very quite deadly. So the United States decides that they need something that's going to really just end this war once and for all. They're not going to be able to finish it the traditional way without huge loss of life on the American side. So for a while, the US had been developing atomic weaponry, and Truman, when he gets into office, he learns, hey, we've got these big bombs, and we want to know, should we use them? And Truman says, absolutely yes. So they do. They drop two atomic bombs, two nuclear weapons on Japan in an effort to get them to surrender. First one on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The next one was on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. And the bombs end up killing over 200,000 civilians. It just levels these cities. It is an incredible feat of destruction. And the but I want to make sure that everyone is well aware of why the United States does this. There are three reasons why the United States drops these bombs, And it can be broken down into three things that all start with S. So I love a good alliteration. The first one, probably the least important one, so we'll start with that one, is to study it, to study this bomb. Because yeah, they have it. They invested bazillions of dollars in it. You don't want to just not see what it does. You want to see if it works. You want to test it. You want to see the result. And this is a perfect opportunity to do that. Part of the reason why the government chooses Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan is because both cities were relatively untouched by traditional aerial bombing. So it was seen as like a perfect testing ground to test these weapons because you'd get a pretty good report on what they did by bombing these otherwise untouched cities. The other one that the United States, the big main reason, the most important thing here, why they're going to drop these bombs, is obviously it's to end the war, and the second S, save the troops. So study the bomb, save the troops. Big one, of course, save the troops, because the Secretary of War for the United States estimated that if the United States tried to end the war a traditional way, like just keep fighting hand-to-hand combat, beach invasions, traditional aerial bombing with regular non-nuclear weapons, that a invasion of mainland Japan would cost anywhere between 250 to 1 million American lives because of how ferocious the fighting would get. So this was seen as a way to force the Japanese to surrender and prevent them from making war, while also preventing the Americans from having to do this very costly land invasion. And the final S here is they wanted to scare the Soviet Union because, yeah, they're seeing them as a future enemy. They're realizing that once the smoke clears, the Soviets are going to be the next big threat. They've never really liked Soviet Russia ever since the Bolshevik Revolution and that first Red Scare. So they're hoping that if they end the war quickly with this devastating weapon, this will put the United States literally on top of the world, and that no one will be willing or able to challenge them as an unquestioned world power because they've got the bomb, and no one is going to mess with the country that has the bomb. And it works. It totally works. Uh, Not long after the bomb is dropped, Japan is forced to surrender. They the United States has more bombs, and they basically say there's more where that came from. You want us to keep doing it? Eventually, it becomes clear to Japan that there really is no other course of action. They It takes a while for the pageantry to kind of go through, but on September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese empire officially surrenders, and the entire war is now over. The day Japan surrenders is known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, and that officially ends the war because it's the second theater of war that closes. And at the end of the war, people celebrate, but it's also kind of a sad day for a lot of Americans because they have to reflect on the fact that over 330,000 Americans have been killed over the course of those last few years. From Pearl Harbor to VJ Day, it was the United States doesn't have nearly the amount of casualties that places like Germany, Japan, France, Britain does, but it's still a big chunk of the population. You've got veterans who are injured, um, people still suffering from PTSD, and so it's a bit hard. But the United States is able to kind of um, emerge quite victorious at the end, and it's really because everybody else is just in ruins and in rubble. It's the United States that comes out on top. The United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the only really big superpower left on that's still kind of not totally in shambles after the war. But the United States really is totally the top dog because they have the atomic bomb, they won the war, and they're basically undamaged. They lost 330,000 people abroad. There's no bomb damage. They don't have flattened cities like Europe and the Soviet Union. They didn't suffer an invasion. So they are primed to reach their zenith. They are going to be extremely powerful and wealthy in the next couple decades because of the victory in the Second World War. And part of it too, why the United States is about to enter an era of great prosperity is because they are going to try really hard too after the war to make sure that they take care of the returning soldiers, the returning GIs. Just as an aside, GI is kind of the nickname for a soldier because it stands for government issue. like you're part of the government. You're a government issue guy when when you're in the army and military. You're a service person. That's where GI Joe comes from is because he's a soldier. He's a GI. And they want to take care of the GIs. They want to take care of the veterans. So the United States government first enacts a GI Bill of Rights in June 1944, looking to set up a post-war America that will take care of returning veterans. And this Bill of Rights was aimed to prevent unemployment and provide a lot of support for returning veterans to really get the country off on the right start once the war was over. There was a lot of issues with unemployment in the First World War. They wanted to not have that happen again. And you don't want to have soldiers with a lot of unrest and anger for their government not being caring for them after they risk their lives for that government. The GI Bill also provides a lot of money for veterans to buy homes and go to college, and it really helps push for suburbanization. You have a lot more demand for homes because people can afford it, and you also have a lot of a lot more men going to college. So you're going to have a generation of way better educated people who are going to be primed for good jobs and they're going to be very prosperous as well. A lot of colleges, if you look, some of them are GI colleges. I went to SUNY Binghamton, that's a GI college. I think a big part of that school was built to meet the demand for soldiers who wanted to go to college because they could afford it now that the GI Bill was going to pay for it. So something that was out of reach was now within reach. So the Second World War puts the United States in a good position financially, somewhat socially, but there are people who are left out of it. African American men are kind of um, really not really included quite so much in the GI Bill of Rights. So a lot of that dissatisfaction will lead to a further push for social change. The civil rights movement is emerging. But the United States is going to have one big problem, and that's going to be the presence of the Soviet Union and the fear of their domination of the globe. So while the United States is about to enter an era of great prosperity and great power, they're going to be kind of dogged the entire time by this specter of Soviet aggression. And that's going to be the Cold War, which is going to start basically like the second that that the World War II ends.